All right, it's 9:30 on my clock, so I'm starting to record this first of our Monday plenaries for this term. My name is Professor Marinoff. Some of you who are in the Tuesday-Thursday section know me already because we had our first Thursday lecture last week. As most of you should know by now, we have multiple sections that are going to be represented in these Monday plenaries. This is a format that has been imposed on all of us by the budgetary constraints caused by the COVID problems. So firstly, I hope that you're all well, safe and well, and thriving as best you can under these somewhat adverse conditions. Please know that the college administration and the faculty and the staff are doing all we can to support the continuity of your education during this crisis, and that we're all determined as best we can to keep things going in one way or another so that you do not experience interruptions in your educational process. Even though the campus is mostly closed and we're doing almost everything online, at least we're doing it. So the technology is keeping us afloat and allowing us to continue with our process. So as you probably have been informed, this Monday plenary is for all of the sections, and each section has, each of you has a very talented instructor, an adjunct instructor, who's running your other weekly session respectively, and who will, or if not already has informed you, will inform you about your particular logistics and evaluation criteria and so forth. But I'm charged with giving you all a plenary lecture each week, and I will do so. We'll also be recording each of these Monday lectures, and I will upload them to a YouTube channel that I've created for this purpose, and we'll share today after the first lecture goes up. Once this one goes up on the air, I will share that YouTube link with you. So, or indeed with your instructors, so they'll share that link with you. And that way, should you have to miss a Monday, or should you wish to review a lecture, you will have the benefit of being able to do so asynchronously on the YouTube channel. So that way we can accommodate a lot more variation in personal schedules, and I think offer you, in some sense, a more advantaged educational experience. Normally, if you miss a classroom lecture, you're done. You need to get notes from from a friend. But this way, you'll have the opportunity to both be in the Monday lectures, or if you can't attend every Monday, at least to watch them at a time of your convenience. And then you'll take the second lecture from your instructor, whoever he or she may be. And my group from the section M will be with me on Thursdays, but each of you will get a second lecture each week. And then we'll roll this way, okay? Again, to those of you who've just joined, I'm Professor Marinoff from the philosophy department, and I welcome you all to this super jumbo plenary of Philosophy 10200. Now, I'm assuming, and it may not be the case, but I'm assuming that perhaps a majority of you have not yet had a philosophy course. This may be your first philosophy course. Tell me, if those of you who are adept with Zoom, can you tell me if you've had any philosophy before? Just say yes in the chat room. If you have, I'm not going to take a poll yet, but if you have, that's fine. Some of you have, okay. We're assuming that you haven't, and if you have, that's fine. You'll be able perhaps to build on what you've learned before. And I hope this will be interesting and informative for you. We have a lot of different material to tackle in 3 different sections. And again, if you have inquiries about your own evaluation criteria in your particular section, address them to your instructor. If you have inquiries, questions arise during our lecture here today, and on any Monday, if you have specific questions about what I'm saying, if you want to clarify the meaning of a word or a concept, or you want to question something, please type your question into the chat room. Owing to the volume of students in the room, I may or may not be able to answer each and every question. So I will do the best I can. And also, if questions linger, this is always a good thing in philosophy. We always have more questions than answers. You should readdress your questions or your unanswered questions to your instructors. Or if you're questioning the answers I give you, then you should re-question your own instructors. You'll get more views on the matter, and that's always a benefit in philosophy. Okay, we like a diversity of opinion is a very good thing. It makes us think a little more broadly and more deeply too. Okay, so that's just a few words about how we're going to work. And this morning, I hope you all know we're going to look at Renee Descartes. He's our first philosopher on the schema. So we're beginning with him. I'm going to share a screen with you momentarily. And just start with Descartes. The first section of this course contains 5 different philosophers, 5 readings from 5 different philosophers. And in this section, we'll be looking at a variety of topics that are both of long-standing interest to philosophers, but also have a lot of contemporary traction, as we'll see. We're going to be looking at philosophy of knowledge, philosophy of existence, and what does it mean to understand something, to know something? What does it mean to exist? How do we know that we know? How do we know that something exists? We'll be moving on to more contemporary versions of this problem in fields of computing and artificial intelligence. We'll be asking whether machines can think in the way that humans do. We'll be asking whether machines understand what they're doing in the way that we think we do. And so that will take us right to the leading edge, basically, of AI and robotics and a lot of other issues that are impacting our daily lives. So these ancient questions from some key philosophers in these areas, as you'll see, do indeed have a lot of relevance for us today. And I think that in every section of this course, part of the aim will be not only to introduce you to philosophers of great historic importance in the Western tradition, right? That's the focus of this course, is Western philosophy. Philosophers not only of great importance in the West, but also philosophers whose questions and whose challenges continue to be relevant to our everyday lives, both in terms of large-scale concerns, as we'll see in the second and third sections of the course, when we tackle subjects like ethics and justice, and finally, in the third section, when we look at very large-scale problems stemming from the prisoner's dilemma. And you'll see that the stuff of life today, whether it's in the microcosm or the macrocosm of humanity, is stuff that is very relevant to what philosophers have been discussing for ages. Not that we necessarily have solutions or answers. If you want answers, you should go across the street and talk to the science people and the engineering people. But if you want to probe more deeply into the questions that drive inquiry and research in any kind of endeavor, then indeed philosophy is the home of all these questions. The university itself is the creation of philosophers, and so we're very much at home questioning ourselves, questioning the world, and trying always to understand in a deeper sense who we are, what we're doing here, and so forth, with a view, most of us would say, to attempting to create a better world rather than a worse one. Of course, we need to disentangle what we mean by that. Terms better and worse are not self-defining, and we'll be debating those in section 2 of this course. Okay, so without further ado then, let's go straight to Renee Descartes and start looking at his first meditation. He wrote 6 of them. They're not long. They're bundled together, Meditations on First Philosophy. And I'll be looking at meditation 1 with you today. And we'll, with my own group on Thursday, look at meditation 2. Your instructors will be building on this lecture and presumably looking with you at meditation 2 as well. And at the very interesting questions that Descartes poses to us in terms of his view of knowledge. All right, so let me see if I can get the screen share to work this morning. I have the meditation loaded on the reader, and I just need now to see if I can remember how to share it with you. So just bear with me. I'm usually pretty good with Zoom, but I'll need to share it. And here it is. Okay. Can someone just speak aloud or tell me if you see the screen that I'm sharing?
I can see it.
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay,
Yes,
thanks very much. Excellent. All right.
We
So
can see it.
good. So Renee J Carter belongs to a group or a period that we call early modern. This is historically a period of philosophy that falls between the medieval period, which persisted for a very long time, several centuries in Europe, and between medieval philosophy and really what we call modern philosophy or the Enlightenment period, is this very important and formative time of early modernism, because these early modern philosophers broke with the medieval, rather theological and somewhat dogmatic tradition of philosophy, and they created the conditions, in a sense, for the emergence of two very significant developments in the West: the scientific revolution, which has modernized the entire planet, and also the democratic revolutions and rights revolutions. The democratic revolutions of the 18th century in the US and France, followed by very much, not overnight, but certainly very, very steady waves of political reform and social reform and so forth, on the heels of which came the so-called rights revolutions, and which we're still seeing in their development. So basically, all of that was initiated, if you like, by these formative philosophers in the early modern period, who really put philosophy on a different course and, in a sense, chartered a course for developments which have affected the entire planet. So this is a big deal. They're not just writing, in an abstract way that's disconnected from the world. Renee Descartes is one of the most famous of them, and we'll see why shortly. A few of his contemporaries, of whom you may have heard, were Galileo. Tell me if that name means anything to you. Galileo Galilei from Italy. Has anyone heard of Galileo? Yes, good. Yeah. Okay. And Galileo, of course, was an astronomer and a physicist, and he got himself into trouble with the Inquisition because some of the discoveries he made that were purely scientific, quite objective on the basis of his experiments, were at that time contrary to certain teachings of the church, which of course brought him into conflict. But eventually he was able to separate out physics and astronomy as sciences in their own right and kind of wrest them from theological control. So Galileo was a very important contemporary and the elder statesman of this group. Thomas Hobbes was an English philosopher who knew both Descartes and Galileo. We'll look at Hobbes in the second section. He so impressed was he by Galileo's success that Hobbes wrote a book that we'll be studying parts of called Leviathan. And Hobbes actually succeeded in separating politics from theological control, which was a huge step toward modernity. Another member of this rather interesting group of early moderns was Baruch Spinoza in Holland, who was also regarded as a heretic and suffered excommunication from the rabbis of the Jewish community in Amsterdam because his views were simply too radical at the time to be tolerated, even in a place like Holland, which historically has been a bastion of freedom and tolerance. So Renee Descartes and his colleagues or his contemporaries really did some interesting things. And today we're going to focus on the first meditation of Descartes. There's a bit of biography here. He's sometimes thought of as the father of modern philosophy, justly. And he was also very well trained by Jesuits, as it happens. He had a very good upbringing in Catholic France and trained at La Flèche, the academy run by Jesuits, very scholarly as well as a soldierly order of the church. He wrote on mathematics and physics, indeed, and he founded something very important in mathematics. Does anyone know what it was, or what it is that we still use today? Has anyone heard of Cartesian coordinates? Yes?
Yes.
Yes, of course you have. If you've done algebra or physics 101 or analytical geometry or a host of other such subjects, you're using typically an XY coordinate system, right? And that enabled the evolution of vector spaces in physics and a lot of other things. And that was Descartes' invention. That's why it bears his name, Cartesian, right? Cartesian coordinates, where he took Euclidean geometry, which was geometry done in the plane, you know, with straight edges, rulers, compasses, and so forth. And he transformed it. He migrated it into an abstract space. And that freed it up from a lot of constraints, allowed us to do more powerful things with geometry and subsequently with physics and other branches of mathematics too. So Descartes invented Cartesian coordinates. Descartes is probably best known and most generally known, however, for his radical epistemology, and that's what we're going to look at this morning. Epistemology means philosophy of knowledge. From the Greek episteme, meaning knowledge, and epistemology is philosophy of knowledge. And I'm going to show you a couple of slides. Before we actually dive into this, I just want you to realize that there are basically two branches of epistemology that we're going to look at in this part of the course. And I'm going to share a slide with you that will show you, hopefully, what these two branches are. And let me just pull that up quickly. Okay, I'm assuming you can all see this. There are two main branches of epistemology. Epistemology, again, means philosophy of knowledge. And this is an older subject, goes all the way back to the Socratics and pre-Socratics, this idea that philosophers are always wondering about how do we really know things, and how do we know when we know? How can we tell a difference between what's reliable knowledge and what isn't? That's Descartes' question. But philosophy of knowledge is epistemology. And two of the main branches are rationalism versus empiricism. And we'll be looking at important philosophers from both branches. Descartes is a rationalist in the tradition of Plato. And these definitions come from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. They're very good and very general. There are many, many flavors of rationalism, just like there are many flavors of chocolate ice cream, you know, lots of versions. Lots of versions of empiricism too. But we're going to look at two extremely important ones. Descartes is a kind of spokesperson for skeptical rationalism. But in any case, rationalists claim that there are significant ways in which our concepts and knowledge are gained independently of sense experience. All right, sense experience meaning the data that we take in from our five senses nominally, right? Things we see, hear, taste, touch, smell. These data are continuously or discontinuously presented to us, both awake and asleep. Yes, even when we're sleeping, we still are somewhat conscious of some of our sensory data inputs. And these data come to us from a variety of sources, and rationalists claim that there are yet significant ways in which our knowledge is gained, which have nothing to do with our sense experience of the world. So to say it a different way, rationalists claim that there are significant ways in which our concepts and our knowledge are actually gained by mental processes and not by sensory experience. Clear? So our minds, in other words, and the logical engines, the intuitive engines, and the rational engines that we possess in our cognitive capacities, the understanding of the mind, as Descartes would phrase it, is the thing that allows us to have reliable knowledge. And that's a way of stating the rationalist position. By contrast, empiricists claim that sense experience is the ultimate source of all our concepts and knowledge. So empiricists are taking exactly the opposed view, yes? An empiricist would say, no. The very fact that you have concepts and knowledge indicates that you have sense experience. And if you didn't, to take, you know, the case hypothetically where suppose you could not see, hear, taste, touch, or smell anything. So suppose you were totally deprived of all your senses by some horrible accident or fate or you know, some other set of circumstances, placed permanently in a sensory deprivation chamber, right, which we can create for experiments on people. we wouldn't know anything. And there's evidence to support their claim too. Do you know what happens to people who spend time in a sensory deprivation chambers? Anybody know this? It's kind of unethical to do it for too long, but psychologists have experimented with sensory deprivation. You can put people in a kind of a suit, which deprives them of sight and hearing and touch. And
someone would go crazy, no?
Yeah, they do, exactly. If you keep them, at first they experience time distortion, and then if you keep them too long in sensory deprivation, they will tend to go insane, at least temporarily insane. So the brain apparently is an organ that requires sensory inputs in order to maintain some kind of stable function. That's the inference we draw, right, from such experiments. So beyond this, empiricists say that it's our knowledge as well, which is triggered by our concepts themselves, are triggered by our sense experience. So here we immediately have two opposing philosophies of knowledge. And in the first 2 weeks, we're going to look at two philosophers who exemplify these approaches, okay? Descartes this week and Berkeley next week, all right? Stanford Encyclopedia is a very, very good source. It's more advanced than you need it to be. Your first port of call for definitions online could be something like the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which gives very good definitions like these. Stanford is going to give you very, very deep or rather in-depth treatments of these issues too, which are usually more suitable for graduate students or advanced upper electives. But if you want to dive into the Stanford Encyclopedia, then good for you. You're going to get a very robust explanation of some of the terms we're going to encounter. But you needn't do that. The Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy is a good port of call as well. Okay, so with that knowledge in the background, let's go then to Descartes' first meditation and see what he has to say from his point of view. I've got to find it now. And this is the thing about this application. It's very fickle. Sometimes it doesn't show what I want it to show, so I'm going to make sure it's still on my screen. And now we'll go back to Zoom and hope it will show it this time. No, it's not showing it to me. I'm so sorry. I'm trying to find my textbook. Usually I'm able to do this quite readily. Maybe I will close some of this other stuff. Oh, there it is. Okay, everybody see it? Yeah. So here's what Descartes wants to do. He has a project. And his first meditation is titled What Can Be Called Into Doubt. So he begins with a doubt-based position on what he knows. And this indeed is characteristic of what philosophers do. Those of you who are taking a first philosophy course should know that philosophy, if it's anything, is essentially a doubt-based enterprise. We use doubt as an instrument of inquiry. So in a certain way, we may be seen as the opposite of religion, because religion is often faith-based, right? I mean, if you are a religious person, it means you have faith. And people who lose their faith lose their religion. Usually, faith is key to religious belief, and doubt is key to philosophical belief. Interestingly, the two are not mutually exclusive, though, because every religion also embodies philosophy. And every religion has in its history philosophers of that religion. So are they calling questions are they calling issues into doubt? Not always. Religious philosophers may embrace the same articles of faith as the adherents do and philosophize on that basis. But pure philosophy, which is divorced from religion and just devoted to philosophical inquiry for its own sake, is definitely doubt-based. And here you'll see that, I mean, Descartes was a fervent Christian. At that time in Europe, everybody was, or pretty much had to be. But Descartes is not doing religious philosophy. Descartes is exercising doubt. And he's going to try to avoid getting into trouble for this. But philosophers easily get into trouble just by doubting whatever most people happen to believe at a given time. That's the way we're made. We like to doubt. Most people like to have faith. Philosophers like to have doubt. So Descartes says the following: for several years now, I have been aware that I accepted many falsehoods as true in my youth. Well, excuse me, haven't we all? Are there not many things that you believed when you were young which actually were quite false? Think about it. Any examples spring to mind?
Yeah, sure. Santa.
Yeah. Santa, what else? Who else?
The tooth fairy.
I'm sorry, I can't understand you.
The tooth fairy.
Oh, the tooth fairy. Those are two great examples. I mean, Santa is very useful, right? To get kids to behave. Yeah. You know, it's the old bribery and punishment system. You know, you do what your parents want, Santa will be, you know, good to you, right? And the tooth fairy, sure. And kids love to believe that stuff. I mean, when we're very young, let's say the demarcation between reality and fantasy is a little hard to draw. So it's hard for young children sometimes to tell the difference. And so these myths have traction with us. And they
like
can
a form of control.
Well, yes, they are a form of control. If you want to be more cynical, they certainly are a form of control. And that doesn't stop. I mean, now to be adult about it, there are many things that we're told which may not be true, but which in fact are forms of social and political control. So Descartes is headed there. I mean, he wants to know. And so he's saying, hey, I built a whole edifice of knowledge on the foundation of falsehoods. And so that edifice cannot be allowed to stand unchallenged. He now realizes that if he wants to base his life on reliable truth and not merely fairy tales, then he has to tear everything down and begin anew from the foundations, he says, if I wanted to establish firm and lasting knowledge. Why? Let me play devil's advocate with you. What's the advantage of having firm and lasting knowledge over believing fairy tales and falsehoods? Why would anybody want to have, why would you want to have firm and lasting knowledge? What's in it for you? Yeah?
You never get disappointed. So it's like you always know what you know. So there's
no, because even if you know something, you could still be disappointed even if it's true. It'd be more like you won't feel like you're being deluded into like being tricked into things because no
right.
Truth is gonna
Okay,
come
so in
into
other words, you will be secure in some sense, right? You'll be secure in what you know.
Like
and
you're confident.
Yes, you'll be confident. You have confidence in what you know. That's all good. Those are all good reasons for wanting to have firm and lasting knowledge. If you think about it even more expansively, I'm sure you'll agree, you don't have to, it's philosophy class, but if you think about it, it's also beneficial for us in particular areas to have firm and lasting knowledge. If we want to have good medical science, we better have firm and lasting knowledge of what causes disease and what cures it, right? If we want to feed a huge and growing world population, we better have firm and lasting knowledge about how to produce food safely and about how to distribute it and so forth, yes? If we want to shelter and clothe ourselves, and we never mind working for more elaborate and more ethically noble causes like justice, if we just want to get out of the caves as our ancestors did and provide for ourselves in some reliable way so that we can continue our existence on this earth, it's going to be based on firm and lasting knowledge about how to start fires, if we need to cook food, right? How to hunt, how to fish, how to gather, how to plant crops, you know, how to build. A lot of things that our ancestors figured out and were able to establish civilizations on the basis of came from firm and lasting knowledge and so forth. So I don't think I have to sell you on this. It's certainly worthwhile for each of us to have some foundation on which we can build. And that's Descartes' point. But the downside is he has to pretty much tear everything apart and start from the beginning in order to achieve this, okay? That's his project. It's quite ambitious. You don't all have to go home and lay awake at night worrying about this. Descartes does, though. He's a philosopher. That's what philosophers do. So he's going to be a radical skeptic. Descartes is not just an ordinary skeptic who's going exercise what we call healthy skepticism, right? When someone tells you something, you don't all necessarily believe it just because someone told it to you, I hope. Even your best friend might be deceived, right? And tell you something that they think is true, but it still could be false, yes? So we want usually to exercise what we call healthy skepticism. You've all heard that phrase. But Descartes' going to go beyond that. He's going to push this envelope and exercise radical skepticism. And so he says, I ought to withhold my assent. I've highlighted this for you. I hope you can see that. He says, I ought to withhold my assent just as carefully from what is not obviously certain and indubitable as from what is obviously false. So if we then just categorize knowledge into three kinds, we'll say that there are true propositions and false propositions, and in the middle there are uncertain propositions. What Descartes is going to do is reject the things that are uncertain as well as the things that are false. So he could be sure at the end of the day, in his plan, his epistemological plan, that his beliefs, his core beliefs, are going to be all and only true ones. So that's very radical, because he's not going to allow himself the possibility of accepting something that might be false in the end. So he's going to preempt that possibility by rejecting things that are uncertain as well. Is this clear? So whatever he knows that he can know for sure, he'll accept as true. And whatever he's not sure about, he's going to reject as false. And I want to say now a couple of words. I'm going to put back a slide just to illustrate a quick distinction between what's true and what's false. This is a big topic in philosophy, and believe me, we could have an entire course on truth and still not get to the bottom of it. It's a very sticky subject, a very interesting subject for us. But I just want to show you very quickly a little example of what Descartes is trying to do. And on this slide, you all see this, right? There are many conceptions of truth. So Descartes is saying, I want to regard as true only what's certain, and whatever is uncertain or false, I'm going to reject. So I've given you two kinds of truths. There are many conceptions of truth. We can recognize two kinds. At minimum, there are two kinds, necessary and contingent. A necessary truth is a kind of truth that can never be false. A necessary truth is like a logical truth, mathematical truth. It's true in all circumstances, all right? And similarly, a necessary falsehood could never be true. So those are the easiest kinds, mostly, or at least the most convincing kinds of truths. An example of a necessary truth would be 1 + 1 is 2. Do I have to convince you that this was also probably true 100 years ago? Like, in 1920, 1 + 1 was 2, right? And probably 10,000 BC, 1 + 1 was 2, and 100 years from now, 1 + 1 will still be 2. For this reason, it's a necessary truth. It's independent of circumstances. And it's probably also true on the moon. That's how we got back when we went there. Our digital computers worked because 1 + 1 is 2, and so forth. It's false that 1 + 1 is 3. Yeah, it's necessarily false, can never be true. And if I ask you, is it true or false that x + y is 2? What are you going to say? Is x + y equal to 2?
Sometimes.
Probably.
Depends on what X and Y are.
Maybe.
What does it depend on?
On what X and Y actually are.
Absolutely. So we can't say it's true or false until we know what X and Y are. They're variables, which could take on a host of values, infinite many values. So if someone says, is it true that x + y equals 2, you're going to say, well, that depends on x + y. So it's not necessarily true, and it's not necessarily false. Yeah, neither. Until we know x and y. So for that reason, it's uncertain. And Descartes will reject it, as he would with the false. The highlighted red things are the propositions Descartes will reject, either because they're false or uncertain. Now, a second kind of truth is a contingent truth. And a contingent truth may be true, It may indeed be true, but it will depend on particular circumstances. And if those circumstances change in a certain way, then it may then become false. So something that was contingently true yesterday may turn out to be contingently false today, just because circumstances have changed. It's like the weather, right? To say it's sunny now is a contingent truth only if it's sunny now. But if you say it's sunny now while it's pouring rain, probably that's false because it's cloudy. Yeah. Here's an example of a contingent truth, or a contingent statement, rather. Albany is the capital of New York State. Is it true?
Yes.
Of course it is.
Yes,
Best
it
of
is.
our knowledge. I haven't read the news this morning, but I
Yes.
don't think they moved the capital. Okay, I don't think Cuomo could even do that. But it is contingently true. But note that it was not always true, right? Because New York State used to rotate the capitals between Poughkeepsie and Newburgh. I think Kingston, New York City. There were various rotations that went on until Albany was made so-called permanent capital. So if you say Kingston is the capital of New York State, if I said to you Kingston's the capital of New York State, that would be what? True or false?
False.
Absolutely false, but it was once true. So we would say, well, it's contingently false, right? Because it used to be true, right? It's just not true today. Similarly, Albany is the capital of New York State is contingently true, but it could be, it wasn't always true. It used to be false. And so it would be uncertain to say New York City will again become the capital of New York State. We don't know, right? It might or it might not. Yes, depending on political change. So that's an example of contingent truths and falsehoods. Now, what's unusual about Descartes, note, is that most of us would agree that it's true to assert that Albany is the capital of New York State. It's a contingent truth, and we would all agree that it's true right now. But Descartes would probably reject it. And the reason he would reject it is that it's a truth whose evidence of being true comes from the senses and not from reason. And this is the next part of Descartes that we want to get to. Most of us would color this green because we'd say, yeah, it's true. But Descartes would reject it because it comes from the senses and not from his reasoning, rational mind alone. And that's where we're headed with meditation. So let's go back, see if the screen share is still behaving. And hopefully it is. All right. And this is what he comes on to. Very important, that next paragraph. Of course, he says, whatever I have so far accepted as supremely true, I have learned either from the senses or through the senses. But I have occasionally caught the senses deceiving me. And it would be prudent for me never completely to trust those who have cheated me even once. This is a very dramatic statement of his grounds for rejecting everything that comes to him from the senses. Have any of you had the experience of being deceived by one or more of your senses?
Yeah. Sure.
Yes.
Yes, such as?
Like those, like your senses, like taste and smell, like stuff like that.
Yes, that can change, particularly if you have a
It's
cold.
wondering, but it doesn't.
Right,
So
what
like
else?
those sugar pills that make you taste things differently.
Yes,
for example.
definitely. White sugar, by the way, if you eat too much sugar, it will definitely change your taste buds. It will make things naturally sweet, not tasteable, because it's so overpowering, yeah? And so forth. So we can be deceived through our sense of taste. And what else? What other senses?
I think even sight. Like, take
Yeah.
apples on the table.
If you could see like a mirage in the desert.
Absolutely. You can see a mirage on the highway. If you're driving on a hot, sunny day, you'll see like puddles of water on the highway where the light is caught in a bend in the road or a dip in the road. And when you get there, there's nothing but pavement, right? So that was our senses. You can also hear things, right?
Yeah, I was gonna say like your sense of hearing, like when they had that Yanny and Laurel thing on Twitter.
I wasn't following that, but anyway, I believe you. Our sense of hearing can deceive us all the time. If you're expecting an important phone call, you'll hear your phone ring, you know. It may be the neighbor's phone. When we used to have phones, now you're carrying it, probably vibrates. But when we used to have phones that rang, if we were expecting important phone calls, we'd hear the phone ringing all the time. Of course, it was just because we wanted a phone to ring. So you get Descartes' point that our senses will certainly distort input in terms of what we sometimes want, or at least we filter. It's well known, right, that eyewitness accounts are reliably conflicting. You have 12 eyewitnesses to an event. They all give you a different story of what they saw. How's that? Our logic tells us that if something happened, it happened in a certain way. Something didn't happen in 12 different ways at the same time. It happened in one way. Maybe 12 different people had 12 different perspectives. But we also know from more sophisticated studies of how the mind interprets data, or at least the brain, that we don't just take in information. We filter it, we gate it, we process it. Yes? So sometimes we see what we want to see or hear what we want to hear, or vice versa. And so Descartes' point is that the senses can sometimes deceive us. And if anything, he says, has ever deceived you, then you can never really completely trust it again. Is that fair to say?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, you can at least see, I'm asking you to kind of just look at things from Descartes' perspective. You don't have to buy totally into what he's saying, especially on the next page, which will be a little shocking. But yeah, and I think that in relationships particularly, this would resonate, wouldn't it? Where if someone ever deceives us, if a person ever deceives us, could we ever completely trust that person again? What do you think?
No.
No.
Probably
Maybe
not.
not, huh?
Depends on the deceive, I guess.
Right. But in any case, a deceit always raises a doubt. And so if we're ever deceived, whether it's by another person or by our own senses, we're going to doubt. And Descartes says, I can't completely trust anything that deceives me. And so when he applies this to his philosophy of knowledge, he immediately takes a very radical step and says, I'm going to completely disregard everything that I've learned from the senses. I won't trust my senses as being reliable sources of knowledge. So this then lands him squarely in the rationalist camp, right? He's going to reject all the evidence of the senses as sources of reliable knowledge, and therefore he's going to become a very skeptical rationalist. Now let's go to the next page. If I can manage to do this, I have to move this bar over. Okay. Now, here is something I think that's very, very interesting. Remember that this set of meditations was written approximately 1634. We're looking at a 1640-ish translation from Latin into English, but we're talking about a 400-year-old text. And this is going to speak to us in a very contemporary way. He says, how often a dream has convinced me that I was here sitting before the fire wearing my dressing gown, when in fact I was undressed in between the covers of my bed. Right? Dreams sometimes seem very real to us, do they not?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
How many, especially nightmares, unfortunately, like good dreams we don't want to wake up from, right? But bad dreams will sometimes wake up, right? If you're having a nightmare, it will sometimes wake you up, won't it?
Yes.
How many times, like if you dream there's somebody in the house, do you get up and check ever?
Yeah.
I have. I mean, you know, it happens, right? We can't tell the difference. When we're asleep, it's not always the case that we know we're dreaming. Sometimes we do, but often we don't. So Descartes says, you know, a dream could be very real to us at times. And then he really pushes that challenge. When I think very carefully, he says, I see plainly that there are no reliable signs by which I can distinguish sleeping from waking. Okay. So this is what Descartes would say if he were in this Zoom meeting. He'd say, how do you know we're not all having a dream?
How do you know what?
That we're not all sharing a big dream.
We don't.
We don't. There's no reliable way in which you can step outside what's going on and say, oh, that was a dream and this is real. We can't really know. We can believe that, oh yeah, this is real, and then we wake up from a dream and we say, oh yeah, that was a dream. But in the moment that it's happening, Descartes is asserting there's no really reliable way in which we can distinguish between sleeping and waking. And so he comes to a very important conclusion. Please hang on to this conclusion, because we're going to be revisiting it in the second meditation and in future next week when we look at Berkeley. So what he figures out is that while certain subjects that study what's in the world, like physics, astronomy, medicine, and the other disciplines, the other sciences, we today call them sciences, that require the study of composites, that means things made of a lot of different elements or molecules together, whether you're studying planets or whether you're studying animals or plants or whatever it is you're studying, they're composite things in the world. He says they're dubious. Why are they dubious and doubtful? Because we're studying them through the senses or through extensions of our senses. Whereas disciplines like arithmetic and geometry, which deal only with completely simple and universal things without regard to whether they exist in the world, are somehow certain and indubitable. This is very important. And the example is whether we are awake or asleep, 2 + 3 is always 5. And the square never has more than 4 sides. But in reality, the things that we study that are composite, which are very specific, whether we're studying a star or a starfish or whatever the case may be, or a society, things that we deem to be real, existing, and made of composites are very, very slippery nonetheless and hard to get to the bottom of. And sometimes we come up with extremely misguided scientific theories by studying things in the world. And really, science is often a history of correcting errors, yes? Coming up with better theories and rejecting worse ones, even though we're studying things that supposedly are tangible and existent in the world, we still have a hard time understanding them. We have a much easier time understanding arithmetic truths, geometric truths, algebraic truths, logical truths, these things which are very, very general. And in fact, nobody really knows what a number is and whether numbers really exist. In a certain sense, they stand for something, right? But the existence of numbers is a big question for us. And yet we know how to manipulate them, even though they're very abstract. And so this is, again, the rationalist position that the stuff that I work out and that you work out with your logical mind that has nothing to do with your senses is somehow going to give you more reliable knowledge than the stuff that we study in the world through our senses. Could you please mute your microphone? Thank you. Okay. So,
Professor, can you repeat what you just said? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I can try. The stuff that we study with our logical engines, very abstract things like mathematical and logical theorems, are yet somehow more reliable knowledge, as they call it, even though they're more general, conceptually, that they're still more reliable in the truths that they yield than the composite things that we study in the world through our senses or through extensions of our senses like telescopes or microscopes or parabolic receivers or whatever measurement instruments, you're using, mass spectrographs, or depends on the science, but we're using instruments which are extensions of our senses to study things in the world, and yet we never get to the bottom of them, even though they're very specific. As a set of things that we study within a given science, we never get to the bottom of it. And very often our knowledge about them turns out to be flawed in some way, or if not totally mistaken in some way, and needs constantly to be corrected. And science is an enterprise of continuous self-correction about all the things in the world that we study. Whereas the theorems in mathematics and geometry, look at Euclid, how many years ago? Right, millennia ago, Euclid's Elements, he proved certain basic theorems in geometry, which are holding up, 2,000 years and more later. They're very general, they're very abstract, and yet they're reliably true for the most part. So this is what Descartes is saying, that what we know through our minds, and listen, you don't need to hear, see, taste, touch, or smell to do logic or to do mathematics.
I have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
How do you use your logical mind if you are in a dream? So if there's like a distorted reality around you, you totally are immersed in it and you totally believe that it's real during the dream. Why can't we use our logical minds to be like, oh, this is not what reality looks like, so I'm obviously dreaming?
That's a great question. I mean, and this would take us into very deep speculation. So let me just give you a quick answer. I don't know if anybody's ever dreamed of a triangle with 4 sides or a square with 3 sides.
You can't.
Ah, well, that's exactly what Descartes says. Whether we are awake or asleep, 2 + 3 is always 5. And the square never has more than 4 sides. Though there's something about that geometric conception which is very stable and very reliable. Whereas we could certainly dream all kinds of crazy things, like we're flying through the air, we're on a different planet, or we're traveling. You know, we have all kinds of weird dreams where things that we dream about that are composite, yes, in the so-called external world and are the stuff of our dreams are not always believable or not always reliable. But even when we're asleep, the mathematics doesn't desert us. So that's why he is taking this position of the extreme rationalist, the radical rationalist. He's saying, oh, I will believe my mind, but I will not believe my senses.
I got it. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. So then he asks a really important question. How do I know anything is really there altogether? I mean, he believes in God, but he comes up with this because he's a radical skeptic, right? How do I know, in fact, there is no earth, no sky, no extended thing, no shape, no magnitude, no place? All these things just appear to us, and maybe they don't exist at all. You know, Bertrand Russell, a great philosopher of the 20th century, asked this question. Don't lose any sleep trying to answer it. But he said, if the world were created 5 minutes ago, right? If everything in like our total reality and everything we know, if that had all suddenly, miraculously, by some enormous power, like some God, had just if that agent, that supreme being, had created everything exactly 5 minutes ago, including us and our memories as we now have them, how could we know? How could you tell the difference? And the answer is you couldn't. I mean, that would be Descartes' answer also, right? So here's where he gets to, and this should be, I think, a kind of exercise for you. And so he doesn't want to overindulge in skepticism. Well, he's already overindulging, but he's going to suppose for the sake of argument. Okay, he believes in God, and he believes that God is good and all of that. But he says, I will suppose not that there is a supremely good God who's the source of all truth, but just for the sake of skeptical speculation, I will suppose, he says, that there is some evil demon, not God, but some evil demon out there who is quite powerful and cunning, maybe even supremely powerful and cunning, who works as hard as he can to deceive me, just for the sake of argument, okay? Suppose that this evil demon is doing the same to all of us. So Descartes goes on, I will say that sky, air, earth, color, shape, sound, all the external things that we perceive are just illusions which the demon uses to ensnare my judgment. I will regard myself as not having hands, eyes, flesh, blood, and senses, but as having the false belief that I have all these things. Well, excuse me, that was 400 years ago. Now, what huge movie did Hollywood come up with based exactly on that premise?
Matrix.
The Matrix, bingo.
But the
That's
Matrix
exactly,
is a book.
That's
So
the Matrix, right?
Yeah.
Okay, because the Matrix is exactly what Descartes has figured out already in 1634. So give the guy some credit. Pretty good imagination to come up with the Matrix almost 400 years before Hollywood. So this is exactly the problem in the Matrix, right? Everyone's wandering around thinking that everything is real, not realizing that they are actually just running a computer program, correct? So how do we know that we aren't? I mean, given what Descartes is hypothesizing here as a possibility, and given that we already know how well able the Matrix is to deceive people, and by the way, on top of that, we're probably being deceived anyway by a lot of media, by a lot of other influences as we speak. So how can we really know what's true out there? It's a daunting challenge. So once again, this is why Descartes rejects the evidence of the senses, to be, if very radical, at least to be on the safe side of his project of building up reliable truth. So he's imagining now that he's being deceived by some evil being, but that he doesn't really exist as a physical body, or indeed even as a person, but just as some kind of program, if you like, that's being run in a mind that convinces it that it has all these physical characteristics, which in fact, maybe it doesn't. So that is the basis of Descartes' dilemma. He's really put himself in this position of wanting to have only true beliefs, only very reliable beliefs. And yet, if he pushes his skepticism as far as it leads, he now is concerned that there's almost nothing that he can really know outside of a few logical and mathematical truths. But then he's bound to doubt even that he has a body, that he's a flesh and blood creature himself. And when he looks out the window, he says, and he sees people passing on the street or dogs and cats running around, he says, for all he knows, they're robots. I mean, such things didn't exist in Descartes' day, but he even supposes that maybe they're machines made to look like people. So he's very skeptical. Okay. Any questions about this? This is the end of the first meditation.
I have a question.
Okay. We have some time. Please go ahead.
Sorry. Okay. So is it not possible to suppose that if Descartes is aware enough to know he might be dreaming, he's actually in his I don't know how to phrase it, but if I'm able to know, if I'm able to suspect that everything around me is not real, or doesn't it have a role to play in me believing, me actually existing in real time, or no?
Well, that's a great question. And if I've understood you correctly, he's going to answer this in the second meditation, actually. I'm just now going back, looking at the chat room. And I just want to see what else is coming up. Many people believe the dream world is another dimension. Yes, but also many people believe that this world is, in fact, also a dream world, and that there's some other reality, or a more permanent reality. And what about Avatar? Yes, Avatar is a great example, Imani. Yes, a more contemporary example. But based on that same idea, but Avatar is a real body, right? It's a body that exists, into which a mind is being projected. So it's more complicated, because the world that the Avatar is running around in on that planet is a real physical world, not a dream world. But it is another kind of example.
There's also the movie Inception.
Yes, this is another newer example. So Karim says Rene Descartes directed The Matrix. Well, he wrote the concept for sure, and The Truman Show, I have to say, I haven't seen. Philosopher. Okay, I guess I should look at The Truman Show since so many of you are mentioning it. Okay, Andrew asks, in The Matrix there was a real world. If we were pure code with no real body, is there still a deception? If we were a pure code, okay, let me ask you this. If we were a pure code with no real body, what's the code running on?
Well, we kind of live in a world where we're basically imprinted in a computer. I mean, whenever you go to the registrar office or the bursar office, they don't ask for your name. They usually type in your last 4 digits of your social, or then your empathy.
All right. And the point being?
That we're all in the system.
Yes, that the system is, we don't really, if you're talking about our identity, as far as the system is concerned, it's just your last 4 digits of your social. That's what it's processing. That's a different kind of reality. I mean, machine reality is not the same as human reality, right? And it's an interesting question. It's going to come up again and again later in this course. In this section of the course, self-driving cars are able to take in much more data than human drivers, because they can be loaded with sensors, right? They can see more, hear more, process more, and do it quicker than most humans. But they're still not as good at humans as doing certain things. And that's a very interesting proposition for the AI designers to figure out how computers that are able to intake a lot more data than us are still not able to make the right decisions at the right time as humans do. And so the world that a machine perceives is not the same as the world that a human perceives. We work in a more limited way, but sometimes in a more accurate way. But even so, there are all kinds of problems in processing reality as we think it is. And the deeper you probe what we like to call physical reality, the more mysterious it actually becomes. Every day, there's some new development in science, I think, that convinces us that the world, what we like to call physical reality, is a much stranger place and, continuously stranger every day, almost, than we thought it was. And yet, again, the fundamentals of logic and mathematics don't change. And this is all, once again, a reason for Descartes to retreat into this notion that the only reliable knowledge is the knowledge of his mind and not the knowledge of his senses.
I'm confused by his perspective, like when it started mentioning of God in the reading.
Yeah.
I'm a little confused by that because, like, does he believe in like faith, or because God is something you can't like see? So I guess I didn't really quite grasp his perspective. What he thought about God. You're saying how like we don't have skin, we don't have this. I'm confused by that.
Okay, so he's not going to discuss in the third meditation. He does discuss the necessity of the existence of God. He actually believes in God. In the first meditation and in the second meditation, he is, for the sake of argument, supposing that there's some evil demon out there, not God, but some evil demon who's causing him to to believe that he has a body when he doesn't really have a body. Okay, so he's just saying that for the sake of argument. He really does believe in God, but he's still not sure about the evidence of the senses. Right? It's not a heretical thing. In Descartes' day, it was not going to go against any of the religious doctrines of his day to challenge the evidence of his senses, because we are all imperfect beings. We're all regarded as being imperfect. And so we're bound to make mistakes. And some of those mistakes are bound to be a result of what we perceive or misperceive or misunderstand about the evidence of our senses, okay? So to reject the evidence of the senses is not to reject his belief in God in Descartes' case. Yes?
Excuse me, Professor?
Please.
I just wanted clarification on...
I can't quite hear you, though. Could you speak closer to the mic?
Yeah, I just wanted some clarification on what he meant by extension, like of his sentences.
Oh, extension. Okay. Now we're getting into the second meditation, which I'm glad to see you've read, and you can take this up. I'm going to cover the second meditation with my group on Thursday, and you will cover with your own instructors. They're going to build on this and cover, I'm sure, the second meditation with you. These are just older terms. Extension's not difficult. It means in one dimension, it would be length. Okay, so if something's extended, it means it has a dimensionality. All right, when Descartes talks about extended things, he means quite literally things that take up space. Okay, so if it's taking up one dimension, we call it length. Yeah, if it's taking up two dimensions, we call it area. All right, if it's taking up three dimensions, we call it volume. All right, so those are the modern terms. And the English has changed, a little bit since Descartes' time. And so when he uses the word extension, he just means that something that is extended in a particular way into space. So it's taking up space, and that means it could be measured. Okay?
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So once Descartes figured this out, like we might just be living in like illusion in the world, right?
Right.
How do you go on about life after like he kind of like had that doubt in his mind?
Right.
Like how do you live life knowing that, or like how can you ethically or like do it?
Well, like I say, don't lay awake at night worrying about this. Read meditation 2, because he's going to answer his question. He's not going to leave you hanging or leave us hanging over all these centuries. In meditation 2, he will come to an answer. And since you're all focused on this, I mean, you're asking these questions about meditation too. I will just go ahead a little bit and just reveal a bit about what he's saying. He's going to be able to come to a conclusion that he really does know something. And I'll just tell you what it is. You'll read this in more depth. But I'm going to give you, I don't want to leave you guys hanging, okay? So here's Descartes' answer. He will figure out by pursuing this line of reasoning that even if it's true, and he can't know, but suppose for the sake of argument that there is this evil demon who's just causing us to believe we have bodies when we don't, right? And believe there's a reality out there when there isn't. It's like we're all in the matrix, right? So how do you actually know you exist? Yeah, that's your question. And we can never be sure about the world. How can we even be sure about ourselves, right? So he comes to a very interesting answer, and it does alleviate the major crisis he's precipitated himself into, but it then forces him, he kind of paints himself into an ontological corner by answering the epistemological question, how do I know I exist? He's going to place certain conditions on the nature of existence itself. And so that's the second topic for us to tackle in Descartes, and that's ontology, which is philosophy of existence. Okay, ontology means philosophy of existence or philosophy of being. And so what I'm trying to say to you, and I'll say it, in brief terms, that Descartes' answer to the epistemological challenge, how do I know I exist, is actually to put ontological restrictions on the kind of existence he can believe in. And the short answer is, he will conclude, as you already see the hints of it in his first meditation, that there are really only two kinds of things in the world. There are physical things, if there are at all things in the world, there are physical things, extended things, yeah, things that take up space, yeah, and there are mental things, yeah, mental things like thoughts, okay? So in other words, he says it in Latin, res extensa, meaning extended things, and res cogitans, meaning thinking things. So your body would be an extended thing because you could measure your height, your weight, you could measure it. So it's extended, right? Taking up space. But your mind would be a different kind of thing because it doesn't make any sense. Descartes would say, and maybe you'll agree, it makes no sense for us to ask what's the volume of your mind? I mean, we could ask what the volume of your brain is, and we could, one day measure that. But we can't ask what the volume of your mind is. If there are thinking things which are somehow different from physical things, we can't apply the same attributes to them, right? Like when we look at a physical thing, we could say, okay, this is its shape. This is its size. This is its mass. This is its weight. This is how much it would weigh on the moon or whatever. This is what it's made of. We're talking about a banana or a rock, or a planet. We can attribute all kinds of properties, right, to that thing. But what about an idea? Like, how long is an idea? Does that make sense even to ask? No.
Maybe in time.
Well, you could say, I mean, that's clever. You could say how much the duration of an idea is. I mean, you could measure how long you have that idea, but does that idea sort of come and go? Or does, if you're thinking about 1 + 1 = 2, what do we ever ask, what color is that idea? How much does that idea weigh on the moon? Like, it makes no sense if we start trying to, what is that idea made of? Nobody even knows what that stuff, no one knows the answer to that yet, right? I mean, we know what the brain is made of, but we don't yet know what the ideas that the brain supposedly generates are made of. And so Descartes is saying 400 years ago that it makes no sense for us to attribute physical properties the way we do to things in the world to the stuff of our mind. And so for him, it's a very different category of existence. Our thoughts are very different. And that's the answer to the question I think Alejandro was asking. So if in fact, and this he is going to go to in meditation too, if there are these two different substances, and he's called a substance dualist because he believes dualism is a belief in two different kinds of things in the world. Okay, monism is a belief that there's one fundamental thing, dualism, two fundamental things, pluralism, more than two, right? These are different ontological positions. Descartes is a dualist. He believes there are two kinds of things, and we call his brand substance dualism because he thinks they're really two different things which don't interact. There's physical stuff and there's mental stuff for Descartes. And the physical stuff is the stuff we're never really sure about because it might be an illusion or we never get to the bottom of it. The mental stuff, like the logic and the math, that's the stuff we're much more sure of. We're sure that we're thinking, right? Whether we're awake or dreaming, we're sure that we're thinking. And his very brilliant argument, I think, to get to the conclusion of it, he says, look, if I think I'm existing, if I'm just thinking, and all of you can try this at home, if you say to yourself in your mind, I exist, say it aloud or say it as a thought, he says, well, I do. The mere fact that I'm able to think that I exist demonstrates that I exist. The very fact that you can think it is sufficient evidence for Descartes of the reliable truth of that proposition. The very fact that you can think that you exist, in fact, for Descartes, constitutes kind of proof that you exist. Otherwise, how could you possibly think it? And the brilliant twist is that he says, and even if this evil demon, right, who's fooling us all into thinking the external world exists, even if this demon is deceiving me into believing that I exist, he says, I still exist. Because there has to be something that exists in order for it to be deceived. Right? There has to be something that exists in order for the demon to deceive it into thinking it exists. So every time that you think that you exist, you certainly exist. Whether because you actually do, or because some demon is deceiving you into thinking that you do, in which case you do. So either way, Descartes says, I exist. And that is where he gets this very famous saying. How many of you, before this lecture, how many of you had heard of this aphorism, I think, therefore I exist? Yes?
Yes.
I think, therefore I am, right.
Yeah.
So amazing to me, most of you maybe hadn't read Descartes or heard of Descartes, but it's still floating around today, right? This aphorism, I think, therefore I am. In French, je pense donc je suis. In Latin, cogito ergo sum. In many different languages, this thing is all still floating around, and it comes out of Descartes' Meditations. I think, therefore I exist. So that is, and I've jumped ahead, but it's okay. That is, in effect, the way he resolves his epistemological question with which he begins. What kind of reliable knowledge can I have? So it turns out that the only reliable knowledge he can have, he believes, is this knowledge of his own existence, but it's a purely conceptual state. He can never be sure about his body. He can never be sure about the external world. He can only be sure about this mental world, this kind of cognitive, conscious world that he inhabits. And so it precipitates in Western philosophy a problem that we're still grappling with. He's not the inventor of this, by the way, but he's the architect of the current version of it. And this is sometimes called the mind-body problem or the mind-brain problem, where for Descartes, the mind and the brain are obviously two different things, right? The brain is something which is physical, and we really don't know that much about it. It's composite, extremely complicated. It's the most complicated organ in the body, yeah? The organ about which we know the least. And it's, the organ that runs everything else, supposedly. And yet the mind is the only thing that we can really know. If I ask you guys, what's on your mind, you could tell me, right? I mean, for the most part, I'm not asking you to tell me, but I'm saying you could. If someone asks you what's on your mind, you could tell them. And Descartes says that's because you exist mentally, and you're able to use that existence to introspect. You could look into your own mind, and you could discover its contents. If I ask you to tell me what's on your brain, nobody can do this.
Professor?
You can't tell me, what's going on in your brain without some kind of imaging or, some other kinds of measurement, right? You can tell me what's on your mind, not so easy to tell me what's on your brain. So for Descartes, those are two very different worlds. Those are the worlds of substance dualism.
Professor?
Okay, so that's an introduction. This gets us through the first meditation. We have like 2 minutes left, so I could take one more question. The second meditation is much more interesting than I've just given you a very scanty outline to answer that burning question about how do we know that anything exists. It's going to get more interesting than that. He'll take up more issues. But basically, I think we better call it. We're almost there today at 10:45. And I hope that you now have a more solid basis of understanding where Descartes' coming from and a little bit of where he's going to. You'll be covering the second meditation in your breakout lectures with your own instructors in my group with me on Thursday. Next week, we're going to look at an empiricist. This week, we've looked at this great rationalist and this great skeptic. And next week, we're going to look at somebody even more shocking. I promise to shock you. It's even beyond the matrix. It's an English or an Irish philosopher named George Berkeley, spelled Berkeley like the university or in California, but in England, don't say Berkeley. Don't say Berkeley, say Barclay. It's pronounced Barclay. Spelled Berkeley, pronounced Barclay. George Berkeley is an empiricist, completely opposed to Descartes. And he's going to tell us something about the nature of existence that is even more shocking than Descartes, I think. So hang on, fasten your seatbelts, okay? He's a radical empiricist, and we'll get there next Monday. But in the meantime, please continue with your lectures, with your own instructors this week. Continue to delve into Descartes' philosophy and see where that leads us. And then I will look forward to resuming with you all Monday morning next week, where we will tackle a very different philosopher and someone who disagrees chapter and verse with what Descartes has to say, okay? Almost chapter and verse. So thank you very much for your attendance, your participation, your great questions. Continue to ask. Always ask questions in philosophy. I always say, and I'll say to you, there's no such thing in philosophy as a foolish question. Every question is important. You may get some foolish answers from philosophers. If you keep asking questions, you're guaranteed to get foolish answers from us. But the questions are really important, and never be reluctant to ask questions. All right, have a great week. Enjoy Descartes. I'll see you all Monday morning next week, 9:30, and we'll tackle George Berkeley. All right, have a great week, everybody.
All right, take care, Professor.
Stay well and be safe, okay?
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay. Bye. Bye-bye all. Bye for now.
Have a great day.
You too.